At Nuremberg, which was the prime place where the Nazis staged their celebrations, was the biggest gathering field ever made in human history. People arranged themselves, hundreds of thousands of people, into perfect squares. Everything, and you remember the jackboot, goose-step march, and Heil Hitler. It's like it's all done in absolutely perfect sequence.
When it came to conditioning a legion of murderous thugs to stand in formation, stick their arms out straight, and venerate history's most infamous psychopath, the Nazis represented perfection itself. Indeed, more than 76 years after their Reich imploded, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is still boasting about their orderliness. He does so while informing journalists, with a straight face, that he is warning of a re-emergence of Nazism, just one of his numberless lies. This clip comes from a lecture at the University of Toronto entitled Personality Lecture 12, Conscientiousness, Industriousness, and Orderliness. It was filmed in 2016, shortly before Peterson became world famous and began counseling his followers, mostly white men, to be industrious and orderly, to take responsibility, and to clean their rooms. When Peterson discusses industriousness and orderliness, he typically links these qualities to Nazism. Watch as Peterson says that when he was reading the literature on conscientiousness, one of the big 5 personality traits which includes the qualities of industriousness and orderliness, he was simultaneously reading Hitler's Table Talk, which he has read at least twice and has rated amazing. I would also column this book under the heading of amazing, because through a lengthy series of discombobulated monologues, it supports the assessment made by American intelligence that Adolf Hitler was a borderline schizophrenic. Peterson has alluded to this diagnosis in class, noting that the Americans were aided by Carl Jung, who was intimately familiar with schizophrenia, went through a phase of admiring Hitler and making anti-Semitic and pro-Aryan remarks, headed the Nazi-regulated Medical Society for Psychotherapy during the first 6 years of Hitler's dictatorship, was summoned to a meeting attended by Hitler, was blacklisted and threatened by the Gestapo, who had his books burned, realized he had been horribly wrong about Nazism, and published an essay in 1945 called After the Catastrophe, which is the most insightful analysis of Hitler and why the Germans supported him that I have ever read. Here's a clip of Peterson talking about Jung and the Nazis. Note how he dismisses Jung's anti-Semitism and omits that Jung briefly supported Hitler and participated in a medical society overseen by Hitler.
Anyways, Jung has been the target of many accusations of anti-Semitism, particularly by biographers who were resentful and clueless and historically uninformed and, I would say, malevolent, fundamentally. He worked as a CIA agent. It was just revealed last year, and he provided psychological reports to the American government on the underlying psychological structure of the Nazi leaders for years. And he never told anybody about that while he was alive. It only came to light, as far as I know, last year, or perhaps the year before that.
Now here's Peterson talking about Hitler's Table Talk. He will say it's comprised of Hitler's utterances as recorded between 1939 and 1942, or when the Nazis were winning the war, not when they were murdering innocent people and preparing for the final solution, mind, but when they were winning. Not when the Western democracies were being conquered and occupied, or when the Allies were struggling, but when the Nazis were winning. Through his speech, Peterson routinely betrays his pro-Nazi bias. He almost never talks about the Allies when discussing the Second World War, and that's because they ruined everything. Hitler's Table Talk was actually recorded between 1941 and 1944. Every time Peterson mentions Table Talk, he gets the years wrong. He habitually staggers praise for the Fuhrer with historical baloney.
Okay, so while I was going through this literature, I was also reading Hitler's Table Talk. And Hitler's Table Talk was a collection of his spontaneous speeches delivered over the dinner table from 1939 to 1942, which was roughly the period where the Nazis were winning the war. And I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. And what I noticed before was that Hitler had a very powerful behavioral immune system.
Hitler had a very powerful behavioral immune system. This is just one of many compliments Peterson will serve up during this lecture. Note how Hitler had a very powerful behavioral immune system is a little like the declaration that Hitler had a very powerfully developed aesthetic sense.
But he had a very powerfully developed aesthetic sense. And he spent a lot of his time designing the cities that would be built after World War II was over. And those cities were generally conceptualized by him as places where the arts, or at least the Nazi version of the arts, could flourish.
Hitler was really powerful and, at heart, a misunderstood artist. Peterson's narrative is almost always told from the perspective of the victimizers, of the Nazis, with little mention of their victims. Apart from a few quotes from Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, Peterson never relays the voices of those oppressed during Hitler's reign. Instead, we hear praise for the oppressors, for Hitler and his homicidal minions. In the next clip, observe how Peterson casually refers to the victims as the people the Nazis annihilated, before complimenting the annihilators by boasting that they were not governed by fear.
So, you often hear that the Nazis annihilated the people that they annihilated because they were afraid of them, let's say. But then you think about Nazis, and you think, yeah, maybe fear wasn't their overwhelming characteristic. It's some more like brutality or something like that, but it's not fear. You don't picture them trembling in their boots, down in a basement or something like that. It's not that. So I was reading this book, and Hitler was very high in openness, by the way, and very high in orderliness.
Hitler was very high in orderliness. What a coincidence, because this lecture is on orderliness and industriousness, and according to Peterson, Hitler was also super industrious. You see, with characteristic flourish, he rearmed and reindustrialized the Third Reich.
In the 1930s, the Germans were starting to get back on their feet, and when Hitler came to power, he started not only to rearm, but to reindustrialize the economy, and he was actually pretty damn good at that.
This isn't the only example of Peterson lauding Nazi industriousness. He has repeatedly praised Germany's engineering prowess during World War II and today, as you will hear him do toward the end of this lecture.
His vision for the Aryan race, so he had this racial theory, right? And the racial theory was that the proper inhabitants of Europe and hypothetically the world were blonde, blue-eyed Aryans, which is really not a category, and that the world would be a better place if they were the dominant group, and that all the other groups were gone.
The Nazis believed in and made explicit reference to a racial hierarchy, and Peterson just said that the group at the acme of this hierarchy represented the dominant group. Think of his overarching paradigm, the dominance hierarchy, and know that he has said that Hitler climbed up the ranks of the hierarchy in a remarkable manner.
And he climbed up the ranks of the hierarchy in a remarkable manner and gained the democratic acceptance of the vast majority of the German population.
That clip was from Harvard 1996. For the record, Hitler did not gain the democratic acceptance of the vast majority of the German population. Peterson has been plugging and fabricating stories about Hitler for decades. Lying about Nazism is a neo-Nazi trope.
Also, then you think, well, how did Hitler conceptualize this Aryan race? And the answer is, he conceptualized it as a body. It was the body of the Aryan race. And then he conceptualized all the people that he was out to annihilate as parasitical invaders.
As you will see, Peterson also counsels his students and followers to protect their bodies. For example, when he encourages them to be aware of their behavioral immune system. Furthermore, he has likened people to parasites. You will see another clip from Harvard where he's giving a lecture riddled with praise for Adolf Hitler and quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, philosopher par excellence, as judged by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. Peterson would know this because one of his conservative academic pals, Stephen Hicks, wrote a book called Nietzsche and the Nazis, and Peterson urges his followers to read Stephen Hicks. Here's the Nietzsche quote.
Nietzsche said at one point, this is the kind of statement that can be easily interpreted as fascist, and Nietzsche gets interpreted that way now and then. He said, the strength of a society can be measured by the number of parasites that it can bear. But the point he was making was the point you're making.
Yeah, Nietzsche was saying that undesirable people are parasites, which is what you were saying, only the student made no such claim. In 2017, Peterson gave an angry public lecture entitled Campus Indoctrination, the Parasitization of Myth. Therein, he compared liberal educators to parasites who had infected the noble field of mythology. But of course, fascism requires mythology and religion and occultism or other forms of hocus pocus. Nazism was underpinned by Völkisch esotericism, a hodgepodge of German mysticism and racism. Think of how the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol was propelled by QAnon. But getting back to campus indoctrination, the parasitization of myth, Peterson quoted Nietzsche yet again, this time to imply that liberals were dirty. For good measure, he equated liberalism to Stalinism and Maoism, and made multiple references to Martin Heidegger, the Freiburg University professor who instructed his students to support Hitler, went on the radio to stump for Hitler, gave the Sieg Heil on campus, criticized colleagues who lacked enthusiasm for National Socialism, and refused to renounce his Nazi faith when he appeared before a denazification committee after Germany imploded. Indeed, Heidegger never forsook Nazism and remained silent about the Holocaust for the rest of his days. Professor Martin Heidegger was a committed, lifelong Nazi. It is almost certainly for this reason that he is often cited by Professor Jordan Peterson. During Peterson's campus indoctrination, the parasitization of myth, he also showed this image of St. George slaying the dragon. Yet another example of neo-Nazi signaling. Here's an image of a 1937 Nazi propaganda picture featuring St. George slaying the dragon called St. George with the swastika. St. George represents the ideal Aryan. Indeed, in Nazi parades, soldiers dressed as St. George, as can be seen in this image. The dragon is what Hitler, in Mein Kampf, called the Marxists, that is, the Jews, the foreigners who had to be slain. The Jew-ridden Bolsheviks were portrayed as the dragon in propaganda posters, such as this one. When Peterson talks about the heroic knight who slays the dragon, he's practicing crypto-fascism. It's a thinly veiled allusion to slaughtering the other. Finally, I should mention that Peterson's parasitization of myth speech was delivered at the University of Wisconsin. Peterson was invited to speak by that institute's Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. You can't, as they say, make this stuff up.
And so Hitler's metaphor for the Nazi genocide wasn't fear, it was disgust. And that's a whole different idea.
A whole different idea that's expressed in Mein Kampf, a volume Peterson cites in 12 Rules for Life. After all, what self-help book doesn't include an obliging quote from the architect of the Holocaust? In Mein Kampf, part autobiography, part political manifesto, and part how-to book, that is, how to be a Nazi and recruit others to the cause, Hitler writes, "This conflict between the Zionists and the liberal Jews soon disgusted me." And the Jew had only acquired the art of twisting the German language to his own uses, and in a disgusting way, without having assimilated any other feature of the German character. In the next clip, observe Peterson imply that Nuremberg rallies represented the pinnacle of human orderliness, and bear in mind that he is forever telling his childlike followers that they need to practice orderliness and get their lives in order. He's telling them, via crude crypto-fascism, that they need to become neo-Nazis. But because they are not the most literate bunch, most of them seem to have no idea what he's talking about. But then again, neither do journalists, and they have expensive degrees.
Now, let me tell you some things about, with regards to the orderly part. Well, you can just check out the... What? You know, you're just not going to see a more orderly gathering of people than the picture on the right. You know, at Nuremberg, which was the prime place where the Nazis staged their celebrations, was the biggest gathering field ever made in human history. People arranged themselves, hundreds of thousands of people, into perfect squares. Everything, and you remember the jackboot, goose-step march and the Heil Hitler. It's all done in absolutely perfect sequence. And Hitler was a great admirer of willpower. He was very happy that he could stand in the back of his car for 8 hours and keep his hand out like this. And he bathed 4 times a day.
Let's review what we just learned from the estimable Dr. Peterson. 1. If you thought the British were impressive with their orderly cues, think again. They are novices compared to the Nazis, whose orderliness at Nuremberg rallies remains unparalleled. 2. Nuremberg rallies were celebrations. Think of them as pre-genocide parties. 3. Nuremberg was the biggest gathering field ever made in human history. Wehrmacht soldiers just gathered there, of their own volition, in the biggest gathering field ever. Wow, that's impressive. 4. The Nazis not only stood in squares, but perfect squares. 5. The Nazis marched and gave the Sieg Heil in absolutely perfect sequence. But of course, Peterson isn't praising the Nazis. Goodness no, he's just saying that they were perfect. 6. Hitler was a great admirer of willpower, and this is what enabled him to stand and give the Sieg Heil for 8 hours at a time. Never mind that he never actually did that. 7. Unlike those dirty liberals, Hitler bathed 4 times a day. Forget that there is no evidence to support this claim. How many times does the world's most popular public intellectual have to make fawning remarks about Adolf Hitler before someone notices? We have no trouble believing that someone could be a communist, but our takeaway message from the Third Reich seems to be that for someone to be a Nazi is impossible. How did we ever come to think that? I am fairly convinced that if Jordan Peterson said, "Look, it's like this. I'm a Nazi. Don't you get it? I've been trying to tell you that for years." His followers, mostly conservatives, would insist that the confession had never been uttered, or that it had been taken out of context by the radical left. Okay, I admit that scenario is unrealistic, because if Peterson's critics, mostly liberals, heard him say that, the majority would probably blink and return to calling him a grifter and making fun of his addiction to benzodiazepines. Other public figures like Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, and Stephen Fry would likely contact Peterson in the hope that they could schedule another interview so that they might promote their products and books.
So what you saw, what seems to have driven what happened in Nazi Germany, and perhaps is one of the things that drive right-wing political movements to this day, is heightened sensitivity to disgust.
To be sure, members of right-wing movements today are disgusted by non-whites, liberals, etc., hence why Peterson sends them signals via alt-right hand signs, as well as alt-right symbols, along with neo-Nazi salutes. And once his crude theatrics attract their attention, he implies that people affiliated with liberalism, for example members of the LGBTQ+ community, are disgusting. Peterson has labeled transgender people gender benders and a sideshow. He has branded gay men peculiar, promiscuous, and has linked them to AIDS. Like all narcissists, he claims to be about order, but works to create chaos. He is a classic demagogue, sowing division and pitting his mindless followers against his enemies.
Now, here's how it all got going. And this is a very brief overview, and many other things happened. When Hitler came to power, and that was about 1933, thereabouts.
Hitler came to power in about 1933 or thereabouts. So it could have been 1932 or 1934, but we shouldn't expect accuracy because few of Peterson's claims about National Socialism are factual, and that's because, far from being an expert on authoritarianism, as he moodily informs interviewers, he's a Nazi crackpot and academic fraud. Also, note his word choice. Hitler came to power, not Hitler seized power and wrecked Germany's democracy. Instead, he came to power, like a prime minister would come to power. But then, Peterson has been suggesting that Hitler was democratically elected for decades.
And he climbed up the ranks of the hierarchy in a remarkable manner and gained the democratic acceptance of the vast majority of the German population.
In the next clip, you will hear Jordan Peterson make more false claims about Adolf Hitler. He commends Hitler for launching a TB program involving vans containing X-ray machines. The problem here is that there was no TB program. Instead, there was the T4 euthanasia program, which involved vans that delivered the unfit to asylums to be murdered, often by lethal injection or poisonous gas. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis may have eradicated over 200,000 of the unfit, who they referred to as burdensome lives and useless eaters. After Peterson praises Hitler for his non-existent TB program, he will also commend him for overseeing a factory beautification campaign, but that program didn't exist either.
He put into place a variety of public health initiatives. And one of them, for example, was he built these vans that had X-ray machines in them, and he went around everywhere and screened people for tuberculosis. Seemed like a good thing. Okay, and then one of the things he did after that was go on a factory beautification binge, so to speak. And so partly that was driven by openness because he wanted things to be aesthetically pleasing, but a lot of it was driven by orderliness. And so you're supposed to go into your factory and sweep the damn thing out and fix the yard in front of it and plant some flowers and, make it all look all nice and suburban and under control. All right, so that was, maybe still not such a bad idea.
Soon, Peterson will outline one of his primary theories, that after Hitler received the democratic acceptance of the vast majority of the German people, he was driven by orderliness. But this orderliness got out of control. Put another way, Hitler's order went beyond order. And what's the name of Peterson's latest book? Beyond Order, published by Penguin. Anyway, to restate, Hitler's non-existent public health initiatives were good.
But, when you go into your factory, well, there's rats there, and there's like bugs and things that shouldn't be there, and so maybe you think, well, let's get rid of the rats and the bugs, and so then you use an insecticide spray, and that spray happened to be Zyklon B.
Zyklon B was a gas consisting mostly of hydrogen cyanide, not a liquid or spray, and once more, the Nazis did not use Zyklon to kill rats in factories. They used it to kill the Jews, who they likened to rats in concentration camps or death factories.
So after that, then Hitler went on a euthanasia kick. And it was sort of like, we can get rid of the people who are not contributing and, who are not fit to live, shall we say. And so that started with euthanasia. And so it started with people who were in mental hospitals, for example, and people who had biological, intellectual deficits and such. And from there it went to people of the wrong religious tradition. And from there, and that was first of all only being rounded up and herded into camps, let's say, or first deprived of your property and of your identity and then rounded up and put into camps. But what it ended up with was genocidal annihilation in gas chambers with Zyklon B.
What you just saw was a rare instance of Jordan Peterson describing the Nazis in a way that was essentially truthful. However, as you may have observed, he didn't say that the Nazis annihilated Jewish men, women, and children, but rather people of the wrong religious tradition.
Right. And so, the Nazis would describe the people that they were tormenting as parasites and as insects and as rats. And that's not fear language. That's disgust language. And so, it's an appalling paradox, because the behavioral immune system, along with the immune system, is clearly designed to stop people from dying, right? I mean, your immune system distinguishes between you and not you, and you do the same thing at many levels of behavior, especially sexually. And who's going to say that there's anything wrong with that? It's the same thing when you try to keep your bathroom clean and your kitchen clean and the city streets clean and all of that. And you think, well, that's all to the good. It's like, yeah, but look what happens when that gets out of control.
Yeah, but look what happens when order goes beyond order. Incidentally, just after Beyond Order was published in March 2021, Peterson claimed it was primarily about the Holocaust, yet the word Holocaust does not appear in the book. With regards to the behavioral immune system, this subject has become a far-right trope. It's often discussed by another alt-right academic and fraud, Jonathan Haidt, who, after listening to conservative talk shows, had what he described as a great awakening. I think that when some conservatives invoke the behavioral immune system, they do so to try and encourage listeners to be wary of other people, that is, foreign or non-white people who may be carrying harmful pathogens, that is, their genetic makeup, which could be detrimental to human health, that is, the existence of the white race. One reason I believe this may be so is because their behavioral immune system talk is typically truncated and simplistic, short on science and long on metaphor. Here's a clip of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt in conversation. I trust you'll find Peterson's story familiar.
One more thing about what happened in Nazi Germany that's very relevant and interesting, because it's useful to get these motives right. First of all, if something disgusts you, if you're afraid of something, then you run away from it or you freeze. But if something disgusts you, you try to burn it or kill it, right? You try to get rid of it or expel it. That's right. You want to get it away and destroy it. So when Hitler first came to power, he put in a bunch of public health schemes, like he had vans that went around and screened people for tuberculosis. And then he went on a factory cleanliness campaign. So the factories were supposed to be tidied up, and he bathed about 4 times a day, by the way, and was also a great worshiper of willpower, which is associated with orderliness.
Now here's more of Peterson gushing about Nazi order. Again, notice how the narrative is told in a venerating way from the perspective of history's most notorious gang of mass murderers, and without a shred of empathy for their victims. Oh, and when Peterson finally manages to mention the Jews, he does so by enthusiastically drilling quotes from Adolf Hitler, and that's because he's a Nazi. Have I said that already?
Oh, there's an example of Nazi order as well. So that's at Nuremberg, and I need to explain this picture to you. So the Nuremberg field was massive, as I said. You see those curtains? Those are lights. And the lights are the searchlights from the Luftwaffe, which was the Nazi Air Force. And Hitler would put those up behind him when he was speaking, and so then he'd have a curtain of lights behind him that stretched up so high into the sky that you couldn't see the top of them. And everybody was organized out there on the marching field. See, there's a good example there. Look at those people on the left, top left. They're organized in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And then on the right, you see a Nuremberg parade ground. And there's hundreds of thousands of people there, and they're all in absolutely perfect corridors. And these are comments from Hitler and from the Nazis. The people of the world will recognize the Jew as world parasite, and there will become a time when there will be one united front of all people against the Jewish world parasite. And humanity will be freed from the most severe illness from which it suffered for thousands of years. So, and here's some quotes from Hitler from a paper called Hitler's Ideology, Embodied Metaphor, Fantasy, and History. The state did not possess the power to manifest the disease, the menacing decay of the Reich was manifest. Politicians tinkering around on the German national body sought most the forms of our general disease, but blindly ignored the virus. At the time of the unification, the inner decay was already in full swing, and the general situation was deteriorating from year to year. This nation did not grow inwardly healthier, but obviously languished more and more. The symptoms of decay of the pre-war period can be reduced to racial causes. Anyone who wants to cure this era, which was inwardly sick and rotten, must first of all sum up the courage to make clear the causes of this disease. They think that they must demonstrate that they are ready for appeasement so as to stay the deadly cancerous ulcer through a policy of moderation.
Let's watch that again. Note the gusto with which Peterson quotes Hitler, calling the Jews a deadly cancerous ulcer. Hitler was in touch with his behavioral immune system. So is Peterson.
They think that they must demonstrate that they are ready for appeasement so as to stay the deadly cancerous ulcer through a policy of moderation.
A perfectly normal delivery. Nothing to see here.
If this battle should not come, Germany would decay and at best would sink to ruin like a rotting corpse. Well, you get the idea. And it's so interesting to me because this is straight psychological research. Most of it's psychometric, and all of a sudden out of that comes this finding that orderliness is linked to conservatism, and it's linked to the behavioral immune system, and poof, you have a completely new explanation for what happened with the Nazis.
At the end of Peterson's video, watch as 3 images appear. 2, which will show up on the right, are of Peterson's Maps of Meaning logo. Note how in the center there's a bent or warped swastika that seems to be rotating backward. Also observe how the surrounding colors include black, red, and yellow, or those of the German national flag. The 3rd image will appear on the bottom left. It's the screenshot for a video announcing Peterson's Beyond Order speaking tour. At the outside chance I haven't made it clear, when Peterson refers to order, he has in mind Nazi order, which, tisk tisk, really got out of hand.
So that's what happens when orderliness gets out of hand. And it's interesting, too, because the Germans are known for their orderliness, for their engineering prowess, for the organization and cleanliness and freedom from corruption of their political state.
My name is Troy Parfit, and I'm the author of The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. Thank you for watching, and if you found this video enlightening, please share.
And Heil Hitler, it's all done in absolutely perfect sequence.